Edward Hartley stood at the window of his lodgings for the third time that evening, testing the latch with careful fingers. The brass was cold beneath his touch, smooth and familiar, yet he checked it again, lifting, pressing, making certain it held fast. Below, Hampstead Lane stretched away into gathering mist, the cobblestones gleaming dully where gaslight managed to penetrate the fog. A faint draught whispered beneath the window, frame carrying the scent of damp earth and coal smoke, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked twice before falling silent. Edward lowered his hand and stepped back, feeling slightly foolish. The window was secure. It had been secure an hour ago. It had been secure every night this week, when he'd checked it just the same way, driven by an unease he couldn't quite name. He smoothed the front of his waistcoat, a nervous gesture, and turned back toward his desk, where his surveying documents lay in neat stacks, the edges aligned just so. Except they weren't aligned, not quite. He'd left them squared before supper. He was certain of it. The maps on the left, the calculation sheets in the center, the correspondence on the right, each pile perpendicular to the desk's edge. Now the maps had shifted, perhaps half an inch, and one corner of the topmost letter had folded under itself as though brushed by a careless sleeve. Edward reached out and straightened them, his movements slow and deliberate, while his mind turned over the small wrongness like a stone in his shoe. It could have been Mrs. Albright, his landlady, come to lay the fire. But she always knocked, and the fire had already been laid before he'd gone down to dinner. It could have been a draught from the door, except the door had been closed, and these were heavy papers, not easily moved by air alone. It could have been his own forgetfulness, some absent-minded disorder he'd failed to notice before leaving the room. But Edward Hartley was a surveyor. His trade was precision. He measured boundary lines to the inch, calculated angles to the minute, and maintained his instruments with a care that bordered on reverence. He did not forget the arrangement of his own desk. He sat down slowly, the chair creaking beneath him in the quiet room, and stared at the papers without truly seeing them. Outside, the mist pressed closer against the window glass, turning the world beyond into suggestion and shadow. Hampstead had always been a place of mists, perched as it was on its high ground overlooking London, catching the weather that rolled in from the north and west. But lately, the fog seemed to carry something else within it, a watching quality, a waiting. For 5 nights now, Edward had heard the sound. It came always after dark, when the village had settled into its evening rhythms and the last of the homeward travellers had left the lanes. A rattling, rolling sound, wheels on cobblestones, moving at a steady pace, neither hurried nor slow. The sound of a coach passing through the night, except there were no hoofbeats, no jingle of harness, no driver's voice calling to his team, only the wheels, distant but distinct, and then silence when Edward reached the window to look. The first night he'd thought little of it. London's outskirts were full of sounds that carried strangely through fog, and Hampstead Lane saw plenty of evening traffic, people returning from the city, goods being moved between the village and the coaching inns down the hill. But the second night, when he'd heard it again at almost precisely the same hour, he'd dressed quickly and gone to the window in time to glimpse something, a shape in the mist, tall and dark, moving past the end of his street. No lamp that he could see, no horses visible in the gloom, Just the shape and the sound, and then nothing. The third night, old Mr. Pemberton from 3 doors down had reported his cash box missing from his study. The fourth night, Mrs. Chen at the draper's found her back door unlatched, though she'd sworn she'd locked it, and a bolt of expensive silk gone from the stockroom. Last night, the fifth night, the Reverend Cole discovered that a sealed letter he'd been keeping for the bishop had vanished from his desk drawer, the lock undisturbed, the room showing no signs of entry. And each time, someone had heard the wheels. The phantom coach, they were calling it now, voices lowering in the village, shops and public houses, a coach that moved without horses, a spectral thing that rode the fog and left misfortune in its wake. Some said it was the old Hampstead curse coming round again, something about a coachman who died badly a century past, and now rode the night road seeking revenge or redemption, or whatever it was ghosts sought. Others laughed and blamed London thieves grown bold, using the fog for cover and the old stories for misdirection. Edward didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in angles and measurements, in property lines and surveyor's marks, in things that could be drawn and calculated and proven. But he also believed in patterns, and this was a pattern. He rose from his desk and moved to the small table by the fire, where his kettle sat on its spirit burner. The ritual of making tea helped to settle his thoughts, measuring the leaves, waiting for the water to hiss and steam, pouring with care into the sturdy cup. He wrapped his hands around the warmth and listened to the silence of his rooms. Outside, Hampstead was going about its evening business. Somewhere below, a door closed softly. Footsteps passed in the street. A measured walk. Someone heading home after a late supper, perhaps, or a servant on a final errand. The sound faded. Edward sipped his tea and tasted iron-dark Assam, solid and real. The fire popped gently in the grate, settling into coals. He thought about the barrister. Cornelius Webb had been found 4 days ago beside the road that skirted the eastern edge of the heath, his body half sunk in a muddy hollow, where a spring seeped up through the chalky ground. His fine coat had been soaked through, his boots caked with clay, and his lungs, so the whispers said, had been full of mud, as though he'd fought the earth itself and lost. The inquest had returned a verdict of misadventure. A man who'd lost his way in the fog, stumbled into the bog and drowned in the dark. Tragic, but not uncommon on the heath's wild margins. But Cornelius Webb had known the heath as well as any man in Hampstead. He'd walked its paths since boyhood, and he'd been working on property disputes, cases involving the common land, the development schemes that certain investors kept proposing, the old rights of way that protected the heath from enclosure. Edward had met him twice, both times at the offices of the Land Registry, where Webb had been researching historical boundaries with the same careful attention to detail that Edward himself employed. Webb had been carrying papers the night he died. Legal documents, it was said, but none had been found on his body. Edward set down his cup and rubbed his eyes. Perhaps he was connecting things that had no connection. Perhaps the phantom coach was nothing but fog and thieves, and Webb's death was truly an accident, and the disturbance of his own desk merely his own tired oversight. Perhaps he should simply lock his door, bank his fire, and get a good night's sleep. Then he heard it. Faint at first, so faint he almost dismissed it as imagination. But it grew steadily clearer, the rattle and rumble of wheels on stone moving up the lane from the direction of the village centre. Edward set down his cup with a soft click and moved to the window, careful to keep to the side where he wouldn't be silhouetted against his lamp. He eased the curtain back an inch and peered out into the mist-thickened darkness. The street below was empty. The gas lamp at the corner made a hazy golden sphere in the fog, illuminating nothing but its own glow. But the sound continued, growing closer, wheels turning at an even pace. Edward's breath misted the glass. He wiped it clear with his sleeve and watched. And then he saw it. It came past the intersection at the end of his street. A tall shape, black against the lesser darkness of the fog, angular and upright like a coach body mounted high on its springs. But where the horses should have been, there was only mist. The shape glided forward, seemingly unsupported. Rolling on wheels he could hear, but barely see. No lamp burned on its front. No driver's silhouette showed against the dim background of fog-veiled buildings. Just the tall black shape and the sound of wheels, moving with steady purpose toward the open heath. Edward's heart kicked hard against his ribs. His hands gripped the window frame. He watched until the shape melted back into the fog, and the sound of wheels faded toward silence, leaving only the hush of mist and the distant complaint of a shutter moving in the breeze. For a long moment he stood there, his forehead nearly touching the cold glass. Then he stepped back, let the curtain fall, and made his decision. He'd heard of a man in Baker Street, a consulting detective, someone had called him. A peculiar profession, but London bred peculiar professions like damp-bred mushrooms. Edward's colleague at the surveying firm Thompson had mentioned him once, after a case involving a disputed inheritance and a forged map. Extraordinary fellow, Thompson had said, saw things in the paper grain that 3 solicitors had missed. Holmes, his name was. Sherlock Holmes. Edward moved to his desk and took out a sheet of writing paper. His hand was steadier than he expected as he dipped his pen and began to write, requesting an appointment at the detective's earliest convenience. He wrote plainly and without melodrama, stating simply that he had observed certain irregularities in Hampstead that he believed warranted investigation, and that he would be grateful for Mr. Holmes's professional opinion. He blotted the letter, folded it, sealed it, and set it on the corner of his desk to be posted first thing in the morning. Then he checked the window latch one final time, turned down his lamp, and went to bed. But sleep, when it came, was thin and restless, full of the sound of wheels rolling through endless fog, and the feeling of being watched by something that moved without horses through the dark. The reply came more swiftly than Edward had dared hope. By the second post on Thursday afternoon, a telegram arrived at his lodgings, brief and precise. Can receive you Friday, 10 a.m., 221B Baker Street, S. Holmes. Edward folded the telegram carefully and placed it in his waistcoat pocket, where it sat like a small promise against his chest. He'd spent the previous day in a state of careful watchfulness, going about his surveying work with his usual precision, while some deeper part of his mind remained attuned to every sound, every shadow, every small thing out of place. The phantom coach had not returned, or, if it had, he'd missed it, but the unease remained, a low hum beneath the surface of normal life. Now, on Friday morning, he found himself in a hansom cab, rattling south toward the city proper, leaving Hampstead's misty heights behind. The journey carried him down through streets that grew progressively busier, the quiet lanes giving way to thoroughfares thick with morning traffic. Costermongers pushed their barrows toward market pitches, their calls rising above the general rumble of wheels and hooves. Clerks in dark suits hurried along the pavements, newspapers tucked under their arms, faces set with the determination of men who mustn't be late. A knife grinder worked his wheel on a corner, sending up a shower of sparks that briefly brightened the grey morning. And somewhere a church bell tolled the 3/4 hour. London in November was a study in gradations of grey, grey stone and grey sky, and grey fog that never quite lifted, merely thinned or thickened, according to some schedule known only to itself. But there was a vitality to it, a sense of purpose and movement that Edward found oddly reassuring after the strange stillness of the past week. Here, at least, everything was explicable. The noise had sources, the movement had destinations. The city was a machine, and machines could be understood. The cab turned into Baker Street, and Edward leaned forward slightly to read the numbers on the doors. They found 221B halfway along, a respectable building, well maintained, with clean windows and a brass plate beside the door that caught what little light the morning offered. Edward paid the driver, added a modest tip, and stood for a moment on the pavement gathering himself. He was not, by nature, a man who sought help easily. His profession had taught him self-reliance, the satisfaction of solving problems through careful observation and methodical work. But this pattern of wrongness that he couldn't quite grasp, felt beyond the scope of surveyor's tools. It required a different sort of measurement. He climbed the steps and rang the bell. The door opened almost immediately, revealing a pleasant-faced woman of middle years with greying hair tucked neatly under a white cap. Her expression was welcoming but brisk, the look of someone who managed a household with quiet efficiency and brooked no nonsense in the doing of it. "Mr. Hartley?" she asked, and when Edward nodded, she smiled. "Mr. Holmes is expecting you. Please, come in. I'm Mrs. Hudson. I keep the house." The hallway beyond was narrow but bright, with good wallpaper in a William Morris pattern and a runner carpet that muffled his footsteps. The air held a distinctive scent, tobacco smoke, certainly, but also old paper, and something chemical that Edward couldn't quite identify, overlaid with the homelier smells of coal fire and this morning's breakfast. It was the smell of a place where people lived and worked and thought, and Edward felt some of the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. Mrs. Hudson led him up a flight of stairs, 17 steps, Edward counted automatically, to a landing where a door stood ajar. She knocked lightly and pushed it open. "Mr. Hartley, sir," she announced, and stood aside to let him enter. The room beyond was unlike any Edward had seen. It was large and high-ceilinged, with 2 tall windows, overlooking Baker Street, but every available surface seemed to be in use for some purpose. Books overflowed their shelves and formed stacks on the floor. Papers covered much of a large table near one window, held down by what appeared to be a human skull serving as a paperweight. Scientific apparatus cluttered the mantelpiece, beakers and retorts and lengths of rubber tubing that suggested experiments either completed or abandoned. A violin and bow lay across the arm of a chair. The walls bore charts and maps and what looked like a framed collection of cigarette ash samples, each carefully labelled. Yet despite, or perhaps because of, this creative chaos, the room felt welcoming. A good fire burned in the grate, driving back the November chill. 2 comfortable armchairs flanked the hearth, and between them a low table held a tea service that steamed gently in the warm air. 2 men rose to greet him. The first was solidly built, with a military bearing that Edward recognized immediately. Something in the straightness of his spine and the economy of his movements. He had a kind face, weathered but open, with intelligent grey eyes and a moustache that gave him a dependable air. He wore a well-cut tweed suit and moved with the careful precision of a man who'd learned his movements in harder circumstances than a London sitting-room. "Mr. Hartley," this man said, extending his hand, "I'm Dr. Watson. Please, come and sit down. You've had a cold journey, I expect." Edward shook his hand, grateful for the firm warmth of the grip, and turned to the second man. Sherlock Holmes was tall and lean, with dark hair and sharp features that seemed designed for alertness. His eyes were grey, penetrating without being unkind, and they took Edward in with a single comprehensive glance that felt less like observation than like being read. He wore a dressing gown of deep burgundy over his shirt and trousers, and his long fingers were stained with what looked like chemical residue. When he smiled, the expression softened his face considerably. "Mr. Hartley," Holmes said, his voice a pleasant baritone, "thank you for your clear and concise letter. Please, sit. Watson will pour tea, which I find is the proper beginning to most consultations, and then you can tell us what brings you from Hampstead with such urgency." Edward sat in the chair Watson indicated, feeling the warmth of the fire on his left side and the comfort of the room settling around him like a blanket. Watson handed him a cup of tea, properly strong, with just the steam rising from it that suggested it had been brewed moments before his arrival, and Edward wrapped his hands around the warm china. "I hardly know if it qualifies as urgent," Edward began, and was surprised to hear a slight tremor in his voice. He cleared his throat. "I may be wasting your time with nothing more than coincidence and an overactive imagination." "Imagination," Holmes said, settling into the opposite chair and steepling his fingers, "is rarely overactive, under-directed perhaps, misapplied certainly. But when a man of methodical profession, and you are a surveyor, I observe, begins to notice patterns that disturb him, it's generally worth attention. Tell us what you've observed." Edward blinked. "How did you know I'm a surveyor?" Watson chuckled softly, and Holmes waved one hand in casual dismissal. "The ink stains on your right thumb and forefinger are from a particular grade of drafting ink, quite distinctive. You carry yourself with precision, your measurements careful, even in small things. You counted the stairs coming up, I noticed. And there's a faint line across your waistcoat, where you habitually rest a measuring chain. Elementary observations. Now the phantom coach." Edward felt something unknot in his chest. Here was a man who noticed, who saw the small things that Edward himself valued, who wouldn't dismiss careful observation as fancy or nerves. "You've heard of it, then?" Edward said. "I make it my business to hear of most things that trouble London and its environs," Holmes replied. "The so-called phantom coach of Hampstead Heath has generated considerable local gossip, though it's not yet risen to the attention of the official police. Witnesses report a coach that appears on foggy nights, seemingly without horses, moving along the lanes near the heath. In the wake of these appearances, there have been several small thefts and one death. Cornelius Webb, a barrister specializing in property law, found drowned in a bog. The coroner ruled it misadventure." "You don't think it was?" Edward said. "It wasn't a question. I think, Holmes said carefully, that when a man dies in a place he knows well, on a night when a phantom coach is abroad, and when that man was working on cases involving disputed land rights, cases that would be considerably simplified by his absence, the word misadventure becomes less satisfying. But facts must precede theories. Tell me what you've observed yourself. And so Edward told them. He described the 5 nights of wheel sounds without hoofbeats, the glimpse of the tall black shape moving through fog, the small thefts that followed each appearance. He told them about his disturbed papers, his checked and rechecked window latch, the pattern of wrongness that he couldn't quite define, but also couldn't dismiss. Watson listened with the focused attention of a physician taking a case history, occasionally nodding. Holmes remained very still, his eyes half closed, his fingers pressed together before his lips. When Edward finished, silence settled over the room, broken only by the gentle pop and settle of the fire. Then Holmes opened his eyes fully and leaned forward. "Tell me about the wheel sounds," he said. "Precisely. Close your eyes if it helps, and describe exactly what you heard." Edward closed his eyes. The room fell away, and he was back at his window, listening into the fog. "A rattle," he said slowly. "Wheels on cobblestones. You can hear the individual stones catching at the wheel rim. A steady pace, not fast. Something heavy enough to make a solid sound, not a light cart. But no hoofbeats at all, no jingle of harness, no creaking of leather, just the wheels. And the shape you saw? Tall, very tall, taller than a normal coach body, I think, though the fog made it hard to judge. Black, or very dark. No lights. It seemed to glide rather than roll, but that might have been the mist obscuring the wheels. I saw it for perhaps 10 seconds before it disappeared into the fog again." "Did you hear it after it passed from sight?" Edward considered. "Yes, for perhaps another 30 seconds. Then nothing, as though it had stopped, or turned off the road." Holmes nodded slowly and glanced at Watson. Some communication passed between them, the wordless understanding of men who'd worked together long enough to develop a private language of looks and gestures. "Mr. Hartley," Watson said, gently, "you mentioned feeling somewhat foolish for coming here. I want to assure you that what you've described is not foolishness at all. You've observed carefully and reported accurately, which is precisely what's needed. May I ask, how have you been sleeping?" The kindness in the question caught Edward off guard. "Poorly," he admitted. "I lie awake listening. And when I do sleep, I dream of wheels rolling through fog." Watson nodded with professional understanding. Quite natural under the circumstances. The mind wants to make sense of patterns it perceives, and when it can't, it continues working on the problem even during sleep. He poured more tea into Edward's cup without asking. "You've done the right thing seeking clarity. Whatever is happening in Hampstead, it's better investigated than worried over alone." The simple validation of his concerns, the acknowledgement that he wasn't merely imagining things or overreacting, it loosened something in Edward that he hadn't realized was clenched tight. He took a breath and found it came more easily than it had in days. Holmes rose from his chair and moved to the window, looking out over Baker Street with his hands clasped behind his back. "I propose," he said after a moment, "that Watson and I accompany you back to Hampstead tomorrow. We'll examine the roads where this phantom coach has been seen, speak with some of the locals, and visit the site where Mr. Webb was found. Ghosts, in my experience, tend to leave very corporeal evidence when examined properly. If there's trickery afoot, and I suspect there is, we'll uncover it." He turned back to face Edward, and his expression was both serious and reassuring. "In the meantime, I want you to take precautions. Keep your documents locked away. Vary your evening routine. If you hear the coach again, note the precise time and any other details. Weather, visibility, other sounds. But don't investigate alone. Whoever is behind this, they've already killed. Once, whether by intention or opportunity. I'd rather not add a surveyor to their tally." Edward nodded, feeling both warned and oddly protected. "Thank you," he said. "Both of you. I wasn't certain. That is, I thought perhaps." "That we might dismiss you," Watson said with a slight smile. "My dear fellow, we've investigated stranger things than phantom coaches, and Holmes has a particular fondness for cases that combine the apparently supernatural with solid criminal intent. You've brought us exactly the sort of puzzle we most enjoy." Holmes gave a dry chuckle. "Watson makes me sound like a child with a new toy. But he's not entirely wrong. The intersection of folklore and felony is often illuminating about human nature. What people will believe, and what some people will exploit about those beliefs." He returned to his chair and picked up his teacup. "Rest easier tonight, Mr. Hartley. You're no longer observing this pattern alone, and as Watson can attest, I'm rather persistent. Once I've taken an interest in a question—" "Persistent," Watson murmured, "is one word for it." They spent another quarter-hour discussing arrangements for the following day's trip to Hampstead. Holmes asked detailed questions about the geography of the area, the best routes to the Heath, the locations of the reported thefts. Edward answered as precisely as he could, sketching a rough map on a piece of paper Watson provided, marking the key locations with a surveyor's instinct for accuracy. When at last Edward rose to leave, he felt fundamentally different than when he'd arrived. The unease remained. He wasn't fool enough to think a single conversation could erase days of gathering dread. But it was no longer shapeless. It had been heard, considered, and met with calm competence. Holmes and Watson had neither dismissed his concerns nor sensationalized them. They'd simply accepted the facts and proposed rational next steps. At the door, Watson shook his hand again with that same solid warmth. "Tomorrow, then, and in the meantime, sleep if you can. The mind works better when rested." Holmes offered a brief nod. "Until tomorrow, Mr. Hartley, and thank you for bringing this to my attention. I suspect Hampstead's phantom will prove most instructive." Mrs. Hudson saw him out, and Edward found himself back on Baker Street, with the fog rolling between the buildings and the city's noise resuming around him. But as he hailed a cab for the journey back to Hampstead, he felt, for the first time in a week, that the pattern might have an answer, and that the answer, when found, would make sense. The wheels that had haunted him were just wheels, after all. Wheels needed axles, and axles needed mounting, and mounting required purchase on solid ground. Whatever moved through Hampstead's fog was real, and real things could be understood, tracked, and caught. He settled into the cab and watched London pass by the window, already looking forward to tomorrow with something very like hope. The morning train to Hampstead carried them through London's northern reaches, past terraced houses giving way to larger villas, past market gardens and brick yards, and the sprawling grounds of estates not yet swallowed by the city's expansion. Holmes sat by the window, his sharp profile turned toward the passing landscape, occasionally making notes in a small leather-bound book. Watson read the Times, though Edward noticed his attention drifted frequently to the countryside beyond the glass. Edward himself watched the transition from urban density to something greener, feeling the peculiar mixture of relief and apprehension that came with returning home to a place that no longer felt entirely safe. They disembarked at Hampstead Station into a morning that hung between fog and clarity, the sun a pale disk behind thinning cloud. The air tasted of damp earth and coal smoke, and the wind carried the wild scent of the heath, gorse and bracken, and something older, the smell of land that had resisted cultivation for centuries. "The heath proper lies to the east," Edward said, gesturing, "but the coach has been seen primarily along the lanes that border it, roads that connect the village to the lower reaches toward Camden and Kentish Town. Shall we walk? It's perhaps 20 minutes to the area where most sightings have occurred." Holmes nodded, adjusting his scarf against the wind. "Walking is preferable. One sees more at 3 miles per hour than at 10. They set out along a path that wound between hedgerows, just showing their winter bareness. Hawthorn and blackthorn reduced to thorny architecture against the grey sky. The land rose and fell in gentle swells, and soon the village sounds faded behind them, replaced by the calls of rooks in the high trees and the whisper of wind through dried grass. Watson walked with the easy stride of a man accustomed to long marches, his medical bag swinging slightly at his side. He'd brought it, he explained, in case they needed to examine anything requiring professional attention. Holmes moved with a different energy, his gaze constantly roving, cataloguing, measuring. He paused occasionally to examine a hedgerow or study the roadway, once kneeling to inspect wheel ruts in a muddy verge with the focused intensity of a man reading a particularly interesting text. "These lanes see regular traffic, I take it?" Holmes asked, not looking up from his examination. "Daily," Edward confirmed. "Farm carts, private carriages, the occasional dray bringing supplies up from the city. The road to the village is well used, though it quiets considerably after dark." Holmes made a small sound of acknowledgement, and rose, brushing mud from his fingers with a handkerchief. "Show me where you saw the phantom coach." Edward led them to the intersection near his lodgings, where the lane from the village centre met the road that curved along the heath's margin. In daylight, it looked utterly ordinary. Cobblestones, patched with newer stones where the old had broken, gas lamps at sensible intervals, a few houses set back behind their garden walls. Nothing mysterious, nothing strange. "I was at that window," Edward said, pointing to his own lodgings. "The coach, or shape, came from that direction, passed through this intersection, and continued along there toward the heath." Holmes walked the route slowly, his eyes on the ground. The cobblestones were damp from morning mist, some of them dark with moisture trapped in their peated surfaces. He knelt again near the centre of the intersection, produced a small magnifying lens from his pocket, and studied something Edward couldn't see from where he stood. Watson joined Edward at the roadside. "He'll be a while," the doctor said quietly, with the tone of long experience. "When Holmes examines ground, he reads it like you or I might read a ledger. Every mark has meaning, every disturbance tells a story." "Does he always find what he's looking for?" Edward asked. Watson considered the question. "He always finds something. Whether it's what he's looking for, well, that depends on whether he knew what to look for in the first place. But Holmes has a gift for seeing significance in things the rest of us would walk past without noticing. Holmes stood and moved to the verge, examining the edge where cobblestones met dirt. He walked perhaps 30 yards in the direction Edward had indicated, studying the ground, then crossed to the opposite side of the road and walked back. When he returned to them, his expression was thoughtful. "Interesting," he said. "The cobblestones show the usual traffic patterns: wagon wheels, carriage wheels, horseshoes. But here," he gestured to a section near the edge of the road, "there are ruts that don't quite match, narrower gauge than a standard carriage, deeper than you'd expect for their width, suggesting considerable weight. And they don't follow the road's crown as normal wheels would. They track too straight, as though whatever made them wasn't being steered in the conventional way." "Could it be a cart?" Watson asked. "Possibly. But why would a cart travel at night, without lights, and why would witnesses describe it as a tall coach?" Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "Unless they're not seeing what's actually making these tracks. Mr. Hartley, you said the shape appeared to glide, as though the wheels were obscured." "Yes, though that might have been the fog." "Fog is useful for hiding things," Holmes murmured. "But it works best when there's something else to catch the eye, something tall and dark that draws attention upward while the actual mechanics happen below." He turned to survey the hedgerows that lined the road. "These run parallel to the lane for some distance?" "Yes, most of the way to the heath proper. They mark old property boundaries, common land on one side, private holdings on the other." Holmes walked to the hedge and examined it closely, parting the bare branches to peer through. Beyond lay rough ground, tussocky grass and scrub, a few wind-bent trees, and in the distance the open sprawl of the heath itself. "The ground here is firm enough for wheels," he observed. "If one knew the route, one could travel parallel to the road while remaining out of sight behind this hedge. The gaps are few, and the branches thick enough to obscure considerable detail, especially in fog." He glanced at Edward. "You said you heard wheels, but no hoofbeats. But did you hear anything else? Any other sound at all?" Edward closed his eyes, thinking back. "Wind in the grass," he said slowly. "A dog barking in the distance. And, yes, there was something. A sort of rustling, rhythmic, coming from, not the road exactly, from beyond it, perhaps. I thought it was just the wind in the hedges." "Hoof-falls on turf," Holmes said quietly, "sound very different from hoof-falls on cobblestone. Softer, almost a rustling, especially at a distance. Dr. Watson, I believe we need to see the site where Mr. Webb was found. Can you guide us there, Mr. Hartley?" The walk to the bog took them along increasingly wild paths, leaving the maintained lanes for tracks that were little more than sheep trails worn through the bracken. The heath opened around them, a landscape that seemed to belong to an earlier age, unchanged by the city that sprawled below its slopes. Gorse bushes hunched against the wind, ancient hawthorns twisted into shapes that suggested struggle. Here and there, patches of bog cotton waved pale flags over wet ground, warning of the treacherous places where springs seeped up through clay and chalk to create pockets of deep, clinging mud. Watson breathed deeply, his face brightening in the open air. Remarkable country, this. One forgets, sometimes, that London has wilderness at its very doorstep. Wilderness that certain interests would prefer to tame, Holmes said. Mr. Hartley mentioned that Mr. Webb was working on property. Disputes. What exactly was being disputed? Edward picked his way carefully around a muddy patch. Development schemes, primarily. There are investors who want to build. Housing estates, private parks, even a spa hotel at one point. The heath is common land, protected by old rights, but the boundaries are complex. Some parcels are genuinely disputed. Webb was representing several of the old families who hold commoners' rights. Grazing, furs cutting, that sort of thing. Rights that would be extinguished if the land were enclosed and built upon. And there's money in such schemes, Watson asked. Considerable money. Hampstead land sells at a premium, high ground, clean air, proximity to the city. A successful development could net thousands of pounds. Holmes nodded slowly. Enough to kill for, if the obstacles were few and the risk acceptable. He stopped walking and pointed. Is that the place? Edward followed his gesture and felt his stomach tighten. Yes, that was the hollow, a depression in the land where a spring bubbled up through black mud, creating a boggy patch perhaps 20 feet across. Sedges grew thick around its margins, and the ground showed the characteristic colour changes that marked transition from firm earth to treacherous mire. They approached carefully. Holmes circled the area, studying the ground, occasionally kneeling to examine something more closely. The mud at the bog's edge held impressions still, boot prints mostly, from the men who'd recovered Webb's body. But Holmes seemed more interested in the drier ground surrounding the wet area. "Look here," he said, calling them over. He pointed to a confusion of marks in the softer earth. Multiple sets of boot prints, some overlapping. Movement, struggle, perhaps. And here, he moved a few feet. The grass is crushed in a line as though something was dragged, or someone. Watson crouched beside him, his medical training evident in how he examined the evidence. If a man were fleeing and another pursuing, they might leave marks like these. But why would Webb come here at all? It's well off any sensible path. Perhaps he didn't come willingly, Holmes said quietly. Or perhaps he was chased and took refuge in the one place he thought his pursuer wouldn't follow, not realizing how treacherous it was in the dark. He straightened and looked around, his gaze measuring distances, angles, sight lines. You can't see this hollow from the road. It's sheltered by that rise and those gorse bushes. A man could die here and his cries wouldn't carry far, muffled by the vegetation and the wind. The words hung in the air, made more chilling by Holmes's matter-of-fact delivery. Edward felt the wrongness of the place settle over him, the sense that violence had occurred here, that the earth itself remembered it. Watson moved to the edge of the bog and studied the mud. The report said his lungs were full of mud. That suggests he was face down in it, breathing it in as he struggled, drowning, essentially, in earth rather than water. A slow death, Holmes said, and one that would leave a man desperate, panicked, the sort of death that might look like misadventure if one didn't look too closely at the surrounding ground. He turned back to study the crushed grass. But someone chased him here, someone who knew the ground well enough to stop before entering the bog themselves, someone who watched him die rather than pull him out. Murder, then, Edward said quietly, or murder's cold cousin, deliberate negligence in the face of mortal peril. Holmes's voice was hard. Either way, a man is dead who shouldn't be, and his death is connected to land and money and phantom coaches that travel by night. He looked at Edward. You said Webb carried papers the night he died? So I heard. legal documents related to his cases, but none were found on his body. No, Holmes said, they wouldn't have been. They were the reason he died. A gust of wind swept across the heath, bending the grasses and carrying the lonely cry of a curlew. The three men stood in silence for a moment, each with his own thoughts. Then Holmes turned away from the bog and began walking back toward the lane. "I've seen enough here," he said. "Let us visit one of the coaching inns, somewhere the drivers gather. I want to hear what the local men say about unusual traffic on the roads. And then, Mr. Hartley, I think we should visit your surveying office. I'd like to understand exactly what documents you've been working on, and why someone might be interested in disturbing them." As they walked back across the heath, Edward glanced back once at the hollow where Cornelius Webb had died. In daylight, it looked almost innocent, just another wet patch on wild land, the sort of hazard that claimed unwary walkers every year. But he knew now what Holmes had seen there: evidence of intention, evidence of cruelty, evidence of a crime disguised as misfortune. The Puy phantom coach, whatever it was, had killed, and it would need to be stopped before it killed again. The Crown and Anchor sat at the junction where the old coaching road met the lane that climbed toward Hampstead village, a timber-framed building that had served travellers for 2 centuries, its beams dark with age and smoke, its floors worn smooth by countless boots. The public room smelled of ale and pipe tobacco, and the mutton pie that was evidently the day's offering, and it hummed with the low conversation of men taking their midday ease. Holmes, Watson, and Edward claimed a table near the fire, where the warmth was welcome after their walk on the heath. A serving girl brought ale and bread without being asked, the kind of efficient hospitality that came from long practice, and Holmes settled back in his chair with the air of a man prepared to listen. The coaching crowd was there in force, drivers waiting for their next fare, ostlers from the nearby stables, a guard from the mail coach who sat alone nursing a pint and reading a newspaper with the deliberate isolation of a man who'd heard enough talk for one day. Watson had a gift for drawing men into conversation. Something in his straightforward manner invited confidence, and within 10 minutes he'd established that the phantom coach was the topic of choice among Hampstead's transport men. "Unnatural, that's what it is," said a burly driver named Moss, warming to his subject. "I've driven these roads 30 years, man and boy, and I know the sound of every blessed vehicle that travels them. But this thing," he shook his head, "it's wrong, too quiet by half. No harness jingle, no hoof clatter, just wheels, rolling like the devil himself was pushing them." "You've heard it yourself?" Holmes asked, his tone casual, but his attention focused. "Twice. Both times in thick fog, both times after dark. Second time was 3 nights past. I was bringing a fare up from Kentish town, and we heard it coming up. Behind us. My horses spooked something fierce. They know when things ain't right. Horses do. I pulled aside to let it pass, but when it came level..." He paused for effect. "There was nothing there. Just the sound, just the wheels. My fare near fainted, and I don't mind saying I touched my lucky piece and said a prayer." An older man, grey-bearded and missing 2 fingers on his left hand, leaned forward. "My grandson works the stables at the Lion," he said. "He swears he saw the coach body itself 3 weeks back, tall as a house, he said, black as sin, rolling along with no team in the traces. Said it looked like something out of a fever dream. Did he see where it went? Holmes asked. Lost it in the fog near the heath. One moment it was there, next it was gone, like it melted into the mist. But here's the queer part. Next morning he found wheel tracks leading off the road and into the rough ground behind the hedges. Fresh tracks, deep ones, but no hoofprints anywhere near them. Holmes exchanged a glance with Watson. Curious indeed. And these tracks, did anyone follow them? The old man shrugged. Ground was too torn up to follow far, and folk don't like going onto the heath these days, not with the stories about the barrister drowning in the bog. Bad luck, they say. The phantom's curse. I don't hold with curses, Moss said firmly, but I hold with my own eyes and ears, and what I heard wasn't natural. Mark my words, gentlemen. There's trickery afoot. Someone's running a rig on these roads, and they're using the fog and the old stories to cover it. Question is, what are they after? Holmes smiled slightly. A very good question indeed, Mr. Moss. Thank you for your candour. They left the Crown and Anchor with Holmes, looking thoughtful, and Watson scribbling notes in a small book he'd produced from his pocket. Edward led them to his firm's offices, a modest building near the village centre, where 3 surveyors shared rooms and kept their records. The office was empty when they arrived, Edward's colleagues out on their various appointments. He unlocked his desk and spread out the documents he'd been working on. Maps showing property boundaries around the heath, calculations of acreage, correspondence with solicitors and landowners. Holmes studied the maps with the intensity he'd brought to the wheel ruts, his finger tracing boundary lines, his eyes narrowing at certain parcels. These disputed areas, he said, tapping one section. They control access to the heath from the south, do they not? Yes, Edward confirmed. There's an old right-of-way through there, a bridle path that's been used for centuries. If these parcels were developed, the path would be blocked. The heath would become effectively landlocked on that side. And these parcels are part of Mr. Webb's cases. 3 of them were. He was arguing that the right-of-way couldn't be extinguished, that it predated the current land claims by several hundred years. Holmes straightened and looked at Watson. So if one wanted to develop these lands, one would first need to discredit or eliminate the legal obstacles. Webb's death removes one obstacle. The theft of documents and correspondence removes others. Evidence, precedents, historical claims. He turned back to Edward. Have any of your documents gone missing outright? Not missing, no, just disturbed, as I mentioned. Though, Edward hesitated. There was one thing. A letter I'd sealed for the land registry, confirming measurements on one of the disputed parcels. I could have sworn I'd used my signet to seal it, but when I looked the next morning, the seal seemed different. Not wrong, exactly, but not quite right. Holmes's head snapped up. Different how? The impression was slightly blurred, as though the wax hadn't been quite cool when it was pressed, and the colour seemed marginally darker than the stick of sealing wax I'd used. Do you still have this letter? I sent it on. It's at the registry now. Holmes was silent for a long moment, his fingers steepled before his face. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but intense. Mr. Hartley, I believe your letter was opened, read, and resealed. The technique is not common, but neither is it particularly difficult for someone with the right materials. One steams the seal loose, reads the contents, then reseals with fresh wax, using a counterfeit signet pressed from an impression of the original. Edward felt his stomach drop. But that would mean someone entered my rooms, examined my seal, made an impression, and then returned to open my correspondence. That's precisely what happened, Holmes said, and likely to others as well. Webb's sealed letter, the one found in his pocket after his death. I'd wager a considerable sum it was treated the same way. The criminals knew its contents before he died, even though the seal appeared intact. Watson had been examining one of Edward's maps with his magnifying glass. "Holmes," he said quietly, "look at this notation here. It's in pencil, very faint. Someone's marked this parcel with a small cross." Holmes came to look. The cross was barely visible, drawn lightly in the margin beside one of the disputed properties. "That's not your mark?" he asked Edward. "No, I've never seen it before." Holmes produced his lens and studied the mark closely. "Recent," he pronounced. "Made within the last few days. The graphite hasn't been smudged or dulled. Someone has been in this office, examining your documents and marking items of interest." He straightened. "This parcel, what's significant about it?" Edward studied the map. "It's the Keystone property. If it were developed, it would cut off access to 3 other parcels, effectively forcing their sale or development as well. The owner has been resisting offers for years, but he's elderly and has no heirs. If he were to die, the property would likely go to auction. And someone wants to know exactly what. Claims might complicate that auction," Holmes said. "They're gathering intelligence, methodically removing obstacles, and using a phantom coach both as cover for their movements and as a tool to create fear and confusion." He began to pace, his hands clasped behind his back. "The pattern becomes clear. Webb was killed because he could identify someone, likely the driver of this phantom coach, who is probably a local man known in the community. The documents are being stolen or copied to understand the legal landscape. The thefts following the coach sightings are partly opportunistic and partly designed to reinforce the supernatural narrative. Fearful people are less likely to investigate rationally." "But the coach itself," Watson said. "How are they managing the illusion?" Holmes stopped pacing and smiled, a sharp, satisfied expression. "2 vehicles, Doctor. One visible, one hidden. The coach body you see is tall, distinctive, meant to catch the eye. It rolls on silent, or near silent wheels, probably rubberized or wrapped in leather. But it has no horses attached to it, at least not in the conventional manner. Instead, it's pulled by long traces, ropes or chains, connected to a low cart running parallel to the road behind the hedges. That cart is pulled by horses whose hooves strike turf instead of stone, making them nearly silent in fog. The cart is narrow enough to navigate rough ground and low enough to remain hidden behind the vegetation." "But surely the traces would be visible," Edward said. "Not in thick fog, not if they're dark-coloured and run close to the ground, and not if the attention is focused upward on the tall coach body. The human eye follows height and movement. We're not inclined to look down at what connects things. We assume conventional arrangements." Holmes moved to the window, looking out at the grey afternoon. "It's quite elegant, really. They've taken advantage of folk beliefs, weather patterns, and basic human perception. The phantom coach creates a legend that protects them while they go about their criminal business." Watson had risen and was examining the maps again. "So what do we do? Alert the police, set a watch on the roads." The official police would likely bungle it, Holmes said bluntly. They'd set their watch where everyone could see it, and the phantom would simply not appear. No, we need to draw them out on our terms. We need bait that they cannot resist, information they must have, or a target too valuable to ignore. He turned back to Edward. Mr. Hartley, how quickly could you prepare a set of false documents? Something that would appear to be crucial land survey results or legal correspondence. Something worth stealing. Edward considered. A day, perhaps, if I knew what they needed to contain. Make it appear that you've discovered an error in previous surveys, something that would invalidate the current development plans for that keystone property. Something that would need to be suppressed or stolen to protect their scheme. Seal it conspicuously. Then we simply wait for them to come for it. Using me as bait, Edward said slowly. Watson looked troubled. Holmes, is that wise? These men have already killed. Which is precisely why we must catch them, Holmes interrupted. And Mr. Hartley will not be alone. We'll arrange protection, discreet but thorough. When they come for the documents, and they will come, we'll be ready. He looked at Edward with that penetrating gaze. Are you willing? Edward thought about Cornelius Webb drowning in mud while someone watched. He thought about his disturbed papers and his sealed letters opened and read. He thought about the pattern of wrongness that had driven him to seek help in the first place. Yes, he said, I'm willing. Holmes nodded once, decisive. Good man. Then let us prepare our trap, gentlemen. The phantom coach has had its way long enough. It's time we taught it that ghosts, when caught, prove disappointingly solid. The next day dawned cold and still, the kind of November morning that promised fog by evening. Edward sat at his desk in the surveying office, drafting the false documents with the same meticulous care he'd bring to genuine work. The irony wasn't lost on him. Using his professional precision to create a convincing lie, measurements and calculations that looked authoritative, but led to conclusions designed to lure criminals into the open. Holmes had been specific in his instructions. The document needed to appear significant, but not obviously so, something that would catch the attention of anyone who understood land law and surveying, but wouldn't scream its importance to casual observation. Edward crafted a report noting discrepancies in historical boundary markers for the Keystone property, suggesting that previous surveys had misidentified the lot lines by several crucial feet. If true, such an error would invalidate recent transactions and throw the development scheme into legal chaos. He wrote it in his clearest hand, included proper technical language and reference points, and affixed his firm's seal to the final page. Then he placed it in a leather document case, which he set prominently on his desk near the window, visible to anyone who might look in from outside. Holmes had spent the morning coordinating with a select group of constables from Scotland Yard, men who could be trusted to remain concealed and follow instructions. Inspector Gregson, a lean, fox-faced man whom Holmes regarded as marginally more competent than his colleagues, had arrived in Hampstead by noon to oversee the arrangements. I still say we should simply arrest the lot of them now, Gregson said, standing in Edward's office with his arms crossed. We know there's a gang operating. We know the method. Why wait for them to commit another crime? Because we don't know who they are, Holmes replied patiently. We have theories and deductions, but courts require evidence, names, faces, testimony. The phantom coach has been clever enough to avoid identification thus far. We need to catch them in the act, with stolen property in their possession and witnesses to their methods. Watson, who'd been examining the street from the window, turned back to the room. "The fog is rolling in early today. It'll be thick by nightfall." "Perfect conditions," Holmes murmured. "They'll expect it to cover their approach, but it will also cover our watches." He looked at Edward. "You'll maintain your normal evening routine. Return to your lodgings at your usual time. Light your lamps as always. We want everything to appear ordinary. The document case should be visible from the street if anyone takes the trouble to look." "And when they come for it?" Edward asked. "They'll likely enter during the night, as they have before. But this time we'll have men positioned to observe every approach. The moment they're inside and have taken the documents, we close the trap." Holmes's expression was calm, but his eyes held that sharp intensity Edward had come to recognize as excitement barely contained. "The key is patience. We let them commit the theft fully before we act. Only then will we have them properly caught." The afternoon passed with the peculiar slowness that comes from waiting for predetermined events. Edward tried to work on genuine surveying tasks, but his attention kept drifting to the leather case on his desk and to the window where fog was indeed gathering, turning Hampstead streets into gradations of grey. Watson read a medical journal by the fire, occasionally making notes. Holmes had disappeared for several hours and returned with information from the local horse traders. 2 men had purchased a pair of draft horses 3 months prior, paying cash and giving vague references. The description matched no one local, and the horses themselves had not been seen in any of the usual stables since. "Kept somewhere private," Holmes said. "Probably near the Heath, where they can be exercised away from curious eyes. We'll find them when we find the coach." As evening approached, Gregson's constables took up their positions. One was placed in a vacant room across the street from Edward's lodgings, with a clear view of his window. 2 more concealed themselves in the garden behind the building, where they could observe the rear entrance. A 4th waited at the corner, dressed as a workman, lingering over repairs to a gas lamp. Gregson himself, along with Holmes and Watson, would remain in the shadows near Edward's building, ready to move when the signal came. Edward walked home through the fog at his usual time, carrying the document case conspicuously. Mrs. Albright greeted him with her customary efficiency and informed him that she'd laid a fire in his rooms. He climbed the 17 stairs, unlocked his door, and entered his lodgings with the feeling of an actor taking the stage. He lit his lamps, adjusted them so the room was well illuminated, and placed the document case on his desk in clear view of the window. Then he went through the motions of his evening routine, removing his coat, washing his hands in the basin, putting the kettle on for tea. Every movement felt deliberate, observed, though he couldn't see the watchers he knew were there. Holmes had instructed him to behave as naturally as possible, so Edward sat at his desk and attempted to read a journal of surveying practices. The words blurred before his eyes. He made tea and drank it without tasting it. Outside, the fog thickened until the street lamp at the corner became merely a dim glow, and the buildings across the street disappeared entirely into white obscurity. The hours crept past. 9 o'clock, 10, 11. The normal sounds of the house settling for night. Mrs. Albright's footsteps below, doors closing, the creak of floorboards as the day's warmth dissipated and the wood contracted. Edward sat in his chair by the fire, ostensibly reading, actually listening with every nerve alert. 11:15, and he heard it. Distant at first, but growing steadily closer, the sound that had haunted him for a week. Wheels on cobblestones, rolling at that steady, purposeful pace. No hoofbeats, no harness sounds, just the wheels drawing nearer through the fog-muffled night. Edward set down his book carefully and moved to the window, keeping to the side as Holmes had instructed. He eased the curtain back a fraction and looked out into the fog-thickened street. And there it was. The phantom coach emerged from the whiteness like something from a fever dream, a tall black shape that seemed to glide rather than roll, its outline sharp against the diffused glow of the distant street lamp. It moved with eerie smoothness, and in the fog's distortion it did indeed appear horseless, as though propelled by some supernatural force. Edward felt his pulse quicken, despite knowing the explanation. The power of suggestion was strong, and the sight was genuinely unnerving. The coach passed his building slowly, and Edward caught a glimpse of its construction. The body was indeed unusually tall, painted or covered in black, with no visible windows. The wheels were wrapped in something that muffled their sound, though not entirely. And though he looked carefully, he could see no traces, no connection to anything pulling it. The fog and darkness hid whatever drew it forward. Then it was past, moving on toward the heath, and the sound of its wheels faded gradually into the general hush of the fog-bound night. Edward let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. So, they were here. The phantom had been seen. Now would come the theft, if Holmes's predictions held true. He returned to his chair and forced himself to appear relaxed, though every sense was straining. The minutes stretched. Midnight chimed from a distant church tower. The fire settled lower in the grate. Edward added coal, mechanically, then resumed his seat. 1 o'clock. Then he heard it, so faint he almost dismissed it as imagination. A scraping sound from below, near the rear of the building, where the service entrance led to the back stairs. A pause, a soft creak of wood under cautious weight. Someone was coming up the back stairs. Edward remained in his chair, forcing his breathing to stay even. Holmes had been explicit. Show no sign of awareness. Do nothing to alert the intruders. Let them believe their approach was undetected. The constables would be watching, ready to move when the time came. The footsteps reached his floor, paused outside his door. Edward's heart hammered, but he kept his eyes on his book, his posture relaxed. He heard the faint sound of metal on metal, lockpicks working the mechanism. Mrs. Albright's locks were old and simple. They would pose no real obstacle to someone skilled. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet room. The door swung inward slowly, and 2 figures stepped inside. They were muffled in dark coats, caps pulled low, faces shadowed. One carried a dark lantern, the beam covered. The other moved with the confidence of someone who'd done this before, heading directly for the desk where the document case sat. Edward kept his eyes on his book, but his peripheral vision tracked their movement. The first man reached the desk and picked up the case, opening it to examine the contents. He held a paper up to catch what little light came from Edward's fire, scanning it quickly. Then he nodded to his companion and tucked the case under his arm. They turned to leave, and froze as the door swung fully open to reveal Sherlock Holmes standing in the doorway, with Watson and 3 constables behind him. "Good evening, gentlemen," Holmes said pleasantly. "I believe you have something that doesn't belong to you." For one suspended moment, no one moved. Then everything happened at once. The man with the document case hurled it at Holmes and lunged for the window. His companion pulled a cudgel from his coat and swung at the nearest constable. Watson caught the document case neatly and stepped aside as Gregson and his men surged forward. The constable dodged the cudgel and grappled with its wielder, and they crashed into Edward's desk, sending papers flying. The first man had the window open and was halfway through it before Holmes reached him, grabbing his coat collar and hauling him backward with surprising strength. The man twisted, broke free, and fell heavily to the floor. He scrambled to his feet and made for the door, but two more constables were thundering up the front stairs, and he had nowhere to go. It ended quickly after that. Both men were secured, their hands bound behind them, their dark lantern and picks confiscated as evidence. Edward, who'd risen from his chair during the scuffle, found himself slightly unsteady, the rush of fear and excitement leaving him trembling. Watson noticed, and pressed a glass of brandy into his hand. "Drink this," he said firmly. "You did very well, stayed calm, let them commit the theft. Couldn't have asked for better cooperation." Edward drank, the brandy burning reassuringly down his throat. "Who are they?" Holmes was searching the prisoners, removing items from their pockets and examining each carefully. "I don't recognize either of them by sight, but I suspect Gregson will identify them readily enough once we have them in better light." He pulled out a ring of keys from one man's pocket and a signet ring from the other. "Ah, here's your seal counterfeiter's kit, Mr. Hartley. And these keys. I'll wager they fit several buildings around Hampstead, including Webb's former office." Gregson had both men on their feet now, his constables flanking them securely. "Right, you lot. We'll have a nice conversation at the station, and you can tell us all about your phantom coach and where you've hidden the real one." He looked at Holmes. "We still need to catch the rest of them, the driver, whoever's running the horses." "They'll be waiting at a prearranged spot," Holmes said. These two were to signal once they'd secured the documents. When that signal doesn't come, the others will either flee or come looking. Either way, we need to move quickly. He turned to Edward. "I'm sorry for the disruption to your lodgings, but you've helped catch 2 thieves and document forgers. The rest will follow shortly." Outside, the fog still pressed thick against the windows, hiding the world beyond. But inside Edward's rooms, with the lamps burning bright and justice being served, the phantom's hold on Hampstead felt suddenly, satisfyingly broken. The wheels in the night were just wheels after all, and wheels needed hands to guide them, hands that could be caught and bound and brought to answer for what they'd done. The interrogation at the Hampstead police station yielded results more quickly than even Holmes had anticipated. The 2 men caught in Edward's lodgings, one a former coachman named Dacres, the other a locksmith called Finch who'd fallen on hard times and harder company, proved willing to cooperate once they understood the gravity of their situation. Murder, Holmes reminded them quietly, carried a far steeper penalty than theft. By 3 in the morning, they had names, locations, and a timeline. The operation was run by a property developer named Silas Corvey, a man with investments throughout North London and a reputation for aggressive acquisition tactics. The phantom coach scheme had been his invention, a way to create fear and confusion while his men systematically removed legal obstacles to his Hampstead development plans. The coach itself was hidden in an old carriage house on the eastern edge of the Heath, a building that had once served a now demolished estate. The horses were stabled nearby, and the driver, a man named Blackwood, who'd known Cornelius Webb by sight, was likely there even now, waiting for his confederates to return. They were supposed to signal with a lantern from the Heath Road, Dacres explained, his voice hollow with exhaustion and fear. 3 flashes, all clear. When Blackwood didn't see the signal by 1:30, he was to pack up and clear out. That gives us maybe an hour before he runs. Holmes turned to Gregson. How many men can you muster quietly? 6 more if I send runners now. But in this fog, moving that many men without being heard. The fog is our ally, Holmes interrupted. It hid them. It will hide us just as well. We need to surround that carriage house before Blackwood realizes his companions have been taken. Once he's secured, we'll have the entire operation wrapped up. Men, method, and motive. Watson had been listening intently, his medical bag still at his side despite the late hour. You think he'll resist? He's already killed once, whether by intention or negligence. Desperate men make unpredictable choices. Holmes's expression was grave. We proceed with caution. Within 20 minutes they were moving through fog-shrouded streets toward the Heath. Edward had insisted on coming, despite Holmes's suggestion that he'd done enough. I want to see this finished, Edward had said firmly. Webb deserves that much. They used my profession, surveys and documents and careful measurements to cover their crimes. I want to see it set right. So he walked with them now, part of a quiet column of men moving through the white obscurity like ghosts themselves. The fog muffled sound and distorted distance, turning familiar Hampstead into an alien landscape of vague shapes and uncertain footing. They kept to the grass verges where possible, avoiding the cobblestones that would telegraph their approach. Holmes led them with the confidence of a man who'd memorized maps and directions with a single reading. He moved steadily through the murk, occasionally pausing to orient himself by a gatepost or milestone, then continuing with renewed certainty. Watson stayed close to Edward, his presence quietly reassuring. After what felt like an hour, but was probably closer to 20 minutes, Holmes raised his hand, and the column stopped. Ahead, barely visible through the fog, Edward could make out the dark bulk of a building, larger than a cottage, smaller than a barn, its roofline sagging slightly with age. No light showed from within, but there was a quality to the darkness around it that suggested occupation, a presence, something waiting. Holmes gathered Gregson and the senior constables close and spoke in whispers, outlining positions. 4 men would circle to the rear and sides, cutting off escape routes. 2 would remain at the road to prevent flight in that direction. Holmes, Watson, Edward, and Gregson would approach the main entrance directly once everyone was in position. The constables melted into the fog with surprising stealth for men of their bulk. Holmes counted silently, on his fingers, giving them time to reach their stations. The night was utterly still, no wind, no bird calls, nothing but the soft drip of moisture from invisible trees and the sound of their own careful breathing. Then Holmes moved forward, and they followed. The carriage house loomed larger as they approached, its weathered boards dark with damp, its double doors closed, but not, Edward noticed, padlocked. Holmes tested one door with gentle pressure. It swung inward on hinges that had been recently oiled. They made no sound at all. Inside, the darkness was absolute. Holmes produced a bullseye lantern from his coat and uncovered it, sending a beam of light cutting through the black interior. And there it was. The phantom coach stood in the centre of the building like some strange theatrical prop awaiting its performance. It was indeed tall, taller than any normal coach body, built up with wooden extensions that added perhaps 3 feet to its height. The entire structure was painted matte black, non-reflective, designed to absorb what little light might touch it. The wheels were wrapped in strips of rubber cut from old tires, thick enough to cushion the sound of their rolling, but not so thick as to make the vehicle unmanageable. But the most ingenious part was what Edward could now see clearly. The coach body sat on its axles normally, but extended forward from it were 2 long poles, perhaps 20 feet each, that would normally attach to a team of horses. Except these poles were meant to be pulled, not pushed, and they angled slightly upward and outward, designed to connect to something ahead and to the side. The hidden cart, Watson breathed, following the logic. Those poles connect to it over the hedges. Precisely, came a voice from the shadows at the rear of the building. A clever bit of engineering, if I say so myself. Took 3 months to get the balance right. The beam of Holmes's lantern swung toward the voice, illuminating a man who'd risen from where he'd been sitting on a crate. He was perhaps 40, solidly built, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent his life working outdoors. His eyes were intelligent and hard, and his hand rested on something Edward couldn't quite see. "Mr. Blackwood, I presume," Holmes said calmly. "Sherlock Holmes. I believe you've been expecting someone else." "I was expecting Dacres and Finch 2 hours ago." Blackwood's voice was level, resigned. "When they didn't come, I knew it was done. Figured I had until dawn to clear out, though. Didn't expect company quite this soon. Your associates were less loyal than you hoped. They've told us everything, including your encounter with Cornelius Webb." Something flickered across Blackwood's face. Regret, perhaps, or something darker. "That was never meant to happen. Webb recognized me from when I drove for the Hampstead Coach Company, before Corvey bought me out of service. He called my name right there on the road. What was I supposed to do? He'd have gone straight to the magistrate." "So you chased him into the bog and watched him die," Holmes said quietly. "That was your choice." "He chased himself." Blackwood's voice rose, defensive. "I only followed. He ran onto the heath in a panic, lost his footing in the dark. By the time I reached the edge of that mud pit, he was already sinking. I couldn't have pulled him out. The ground wouldn't have held me. I would have died too." "You could have fetched help," Watson said, his medical training making his voice sharp with judgment. "There was time. Men have been pulled from bogs before, with ropes and planks and quick action. You chose to let him die because it was convenient." Blackwood's face hardened. "You weren't there. You didn't see how fast he went down, how the mud took him. It was over in minutes." "Minutes during which you stood and watched," Holmes said, "and then took his papers and left him to be found by strangers. That, Mr. Blackwood, is what distinguishes misadventure from murder in the eyes of the law." For a long moment, silence held in the carriage house. Then Blackwood's shoulders slumped slightly, and Edward saw what his hand had been resting on. A pistol, old but serviceable, lying on the crate beside him. "Don't," Holmes said, his voice sharp as a whip crack. "That makes it worse, and you know it. You're caught. Your associates have confessed. Corvey will disavow you the moment he's questioned. The only choice you have now is how you face what comes next." Blackwood looked at the pistol, then at the circle of men in the doorway, then back at Holmes. Something in his face crumbled, the last resistance giving way to exhausted acceptance. "I didn't mean for it to go this way," he said quietly. "It was supposed to be simple. Scare some people, lift some papers, make some money. Not that." "It never is," Watson said, not unkindly. "But intentions don't undo consequences." Gregson moved forward with 2 constables flanking him. "Silas Blackwood, I'm arresting you for the murder of Cornelius Webb, for theft, for conspiracy to defraud, and for a list of other charges I'll enumerate once we're at the station. Come along quietly, now." Blackwood offered no resistance as they bound his hands. He looked at the phantom coach one last time, his expression unreadable. "It worked, you know. For weeks, it worked perfectly. Folk believed in the phantom. They stayed indoors after dark, didn't ask questions, let their imaginations do our work for us. It was almost beautiful, in a way. Using old fears, old stories, making them serve new purposes. Using fear as a weapon," Holmes corrected. "There's nothing beautiful in that. You terrorized a community, stole from working people, and murdered a man who was only trying to do his job. The ingenuity of your method doesn't absolve the criminality of your intent." As the constables led Blackwood out into the fog, Holmes turned his attention to the carriage house's remaining secrets. With Watson's help, he located the low cart that had pulled the phantom coach. It was stored in a lean-to behind the main building, a sturdy platform on narrow wheels with long shafts extending backward. When assembled, the system would have worked exactly as Holmes had deduced. Horses pulling the cart along rough ground behind hedges, connected by long traces to the tall coach body rolling on the road. In fog, with the cart hidden, and the coach body illuminated by strategic use of a covered lantern, the illusion of a horseless phantom would be complete. "Remarkable engineering," Watson admitted, examining the connection points. "Wrong purposes, but remarkable nonetheless." Edward stood in the doorway, looking at the apparatus that had frightened Hampstead for weeks, that had provided cover for theft and murder, that had disrupted his own peace and driven him to seek help from a consulting detective in Baker Street. In the light of Holmes's lantern, it looked decidedly unghostly, just wood and metal and rubber, stained with mud and showing signs of hard use. "It seems smaller now," he said quietly. "Less frightening." Holmes joined him, wiping his hands with a handkerchief. "That's the nature of mysteries, Mr. Hartley. The unknown is always more frightening than the known. Once you understand the mechanism, the fear dissolves. What remains is simply evidence, to be documented and presented in court." Dawn was breaking as they made their way back toward the village, the fog beginning to thin under the strengthening light. The phantom coach, both halves of it, was loaded onto a police wagon to be taken as evidence. Blackwood was already at the station, giving his full statement. Corvey would be arrested before noon, his development scheme in ruins, his reputation destroyed. As they walked, Edward felt the last of his unease lifting like the fog around them. The pattern that had troubled him was broken. The night had been explained and silenced. Hampstead would sleep easy again, and the heath would remain open common land, protected by the very legal framework that Corvey and his phantom had tried to circumvent. "Thank you," Edward said to Holmes and Watson as they reached the village centre. "Both of you. I came to you with shadows and sounds, and you've turned them into evidence and justice." Holmes smiled slightly. You came to us with careful observations and legitimate concern. The justice was always there, Mr. Hartley. It merely needed uncovering. The sun broke through the last of the fog, illuminating Hampstead in clear morning light, and somewhere on the heath a curlew called, wild, free, and utterly unafraid. 3 days later, Edward Hartley climbed the familiar 17 steps to the rooms at 221B Baker Street, carrying with him a sense of completion that felt almost physical. A weight lifted, a circle closed. The fog that had blanketed London earlier in the week had finally cleared, leaving the city washed clean under pale November sunlight. Baker Street bustled with its usual afternoon traffic, but Edward barely noticed the noise. His mind was on other things. Mrs. Hudson answered his ring with a welcoming smile. "Mr. Hartley, isn't it? They're expecting you. Go right up. They've just finished lunch, so you're perfectly timed." The sitting room at 221B looked much as it had on his first visit, though perhaps slightly more cluttered. The breakfast things hadn't yet been cleared from the table, and there were newspapers scattered across the sofa. Holmes stood by the window in his shirt-sleeves and waistcoat, examining something on a glass slide held up to the light. Watson sat in his usual chair, writing in what Edward recognized as his case journal, the nib of his pen moving steadily across the page. Both men looked up as Edward entered, and Watson rose immediately, extending his hand. "Mr. Hartley, come in, come in. Perfect timing. We were just discussing your case. Or rather, I was writing it up, while Holmes complained about my dramatic embellishments." "I never complain," Holmes said mildly, setting down his slide and turning from the window. "I merely suggest that accuracy needn't be sacrificed to narrative flourish. But Watson is incorrigible. He persists in making me sound like a character from a penny dreadful rather than a working detective." Despite the words, there was affection in his tone. "Sit down, Mr. Hartley. Mrs. Hudson will bring tea in a moment. She has an uncanny ability to know when visitors arrive." Edward took the chair Holmes indicated, and found himself relaxing into its comfortable embrace. The fire crackled pleasantly, and the room held that particular quality of peaceful industry that he'd noticed on his first visit. This was a place where minds worked, where problems were solved, where the disordered world was examined and put right. "I wanted to thank you both properly," Edward began, "and to tell you that the magistrate has formally charged all 4 men, Corvey, Blackwood, Dacres, and Finch. The prosecutor says the evidence is overwhelming. The trial will likely be brief." "Justice moving with unusual efficiency," Watson observed. "That's gratifying to hear." It helps that Corvey's solicitor advised him to plead guilty to the fraud and conspiracy charges in exchange for the Crown not pursuing the murder charge against him directly, Holmes said, returning to his chair and steepling his fingers in that characteristic gesture. "He'll claim he had no knowledge of Webb's death, that Blackwood acted independently in that regard. It's a coward's defence, but it may keep him from the noose. Blackwood himself will face the murder charge, and given his confession, he'll likely hang or spend the rest of his life in prison." Edward nodded slowly. He'd expected as much. "The community is still processing it all. Half of Hampstead feels foolish for believing in the phantom, and the other half is simply relieved it's over. The coaching men at the Crown and Anchor are telling everyone they suspected trickery all along, though I remember their faces when they spoke of it before. They were as frightened as anyone." "Fear is democratic," Holmes observed. "It affects the rational and irrational alike. especially when it's deliberately cultivated. Corvée understood that. He used folklore and atmosphere as tools, which shows a certain psychological sophistication, however misapplied. Mrs. Hudson arrived with tea and a plate of biscuits, tutting at the state of the breakfast table, but saying nothing as she cleared space. When she'd gone, Watson poured for all three of them with practiced ease. "What will happen to the disputed properties now?" Watson asked. "The ones Corvée was trying to develop." "The legal challenges stand," Edward replied. Webb's work wasn't lost. His office had copies of most documents, and the land registry had the rest. Without Corvé's interference, the cases will proceed normally, and I suspect the Heath's protections will be upheld. The old landowners and commoners are organized now, alert to the tactics that might be used against them. Corvé's scheme may have actually strengthened their position by making them vigilant. "An ironic legacy for a criminal enterprise," Holmes said, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He meant to steal common land, and instead galvanized its defenders. There's a lesson in that about unintended consequences. Edward sipped his tea. It was excellent, as it had been on his first visit, strong and properly brewed, and felt the last knots of tension unwinding from his shoulders. The pattern that had disturbed him was not just broken, but understood, its pieces laid out and explained. His desk at the surveying office was his own again, his documents unmolested, his seals secure. He slept soundly now, untroubled by the sound of wheels and fog. "I've learned something from all this," Edward said after a moment, "about observation and interpretation. I notice things. That's my profession, noticing and measuring and recording. But I didn't know what to do with what I noticed when the pattern didn't fit my expectations. I thought I might be imagining things or overreacting. It took courage to come here, to seek help." Watson nodded with understanding. "That's often the hardest step, admitting that something is beyond our individual capacity to solve. We're trained to be self-reliant, especially as professional men. Asking for help feels like admitting failure." "But it isn't failure," Holmes said firmly. "It's practical intelligence. You recognize the limits of your expertise and sought someone whose expertise complemented your own. That's precisely what any sensible person should do. I consult specialists constantly, chemists, botanists, physicians." He gestured at Watson. "Men who know things I don't. There's no shame in it. Quite the contrary." "Still," Edward said, "I felt somewhat foolish. Coming to London to report Sounds in the Fog and Disturbed papers. Sounds in the Fog that proved to be a criminal conspiracy," Holmes reminded him. "Disturbed papers that were evidence of systematic document theft and forgery. Your instincts were sound, Mr. Hartley. You noticed what deserved noticing. Many men would have dismissed those small anomalies as imagination or coincidence. You trusted your observations enough to act on them, and because you did, a murderer has been caught and a corrupt scheme dismantled." The words settled something in Edward that he hadn't realized still needed settling. He'd done the right thing. His careful, methodical nature, the same quality that made him a good surveyor, had served him well in this larger context. The skills translated. Observation was observation, whether applied to boundary markers or phantom coaches. "What will you do now?" Watson asked. "Return to normal surveying work?" "Yes, though I suspect I'll never see it quite the same way again," Edward replied. "Every map, every property line, every sealed document. I'll remember that they matter in ways beyond mere measurement. They represent ownership, rights, legacy. People will fight over them, scheme for them, even kill for them. My work isn't just technical, it's part of larger human stories. An astute observation, Holmes said. Most people move through the world not realizing how much invisible structure surrounds them. Laws, precedents, recorded claims, documented rights. Your profession maintains that structure. It's vital work, more vital than most people appreciate. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, drinking their tea. The fire popped and settled. Outside, a street vendor called his wares in a sing-song voice. The everyday sounds of London, ordinary and reassuring. "Will you write this one up?" Edward asked Watson. "For your chronicles." Watson glanced at Holmes, who made a small gesture that might have been permission or resignation. "I expect so," Watson said, "though I'll change some details to protect privacy. Names, specific locations, that sort of thing. But the essential story deserves recording. The phantom coach that proved all too real. The man who noticed what others dismissed. The clever illusion that hid a brutal crime. Yes, I think it will make a good account. Just try to avoid calling me hawk-like or having me utter deductions while examining mud with singular intensity," Holmes said dryly. "I'm a consulting detective, Watson, not a character in a Gothic novel." "You absolutely examined mud with singular intensity," Watson countered, grinning. "I watched you do it, and your profile is decidedly hawk-like when you're concentrating. I report what I observe. You report what you dramatize. Merely what's necessary to make the accounts readable." Edward found himself smiling at their banter, clearly a long-established pattern between them, worn comfortable by repetition. There was genuine affection there, the kind that came from shared experiences and mutual respect. He felt honored to have been, however briefly, part of their world. "I should let you return to your work," Edward said, setting down his cup. "I know you have other cases, other mysteries demanding attention." "Nothing quite as urgent as phantom coaches," Holmes assured him. "At the moment I'm merely consulting on a matter of forged antiquities, which is intellectually interesting, but hardly pressing. Please don't feel you're imposing." But Edward could see the glass slide waiting by the window, the scattered papers that suggested other projects in progress. These men had given him their time and skill when he needed it, had put his problem first, had seen it through to resolution. He didn't want to overstay or presume further on their generosity. Watson walked him to the door, and at the threshold, Edward paused. "If I ever notice anything else, anything that seems wrong in a way I can't quite explain, may I write to you again?" "Absolutely," Watson said warmly. "Holmes has his official clients from the Yard and the government, but he appreciates cases like yours, puzzles that come from ordinary observation, mysteries that hide in plain sight. You're always welcome here, Mr. Hartley." Holmes had followed them to the landing. "And remember what you've learned," he added. "Trust your observations. Document what you see. And when something doesn't fit the expected pattern, investigate rather than dismiss. You've proven yourself a natural detective, Mr. Hartley. That's a rare quality." Edward shook both their hands, and as he descended the 17 steps to Baker Street, he felt fundamentally changed from the anxious man who'd climbed them just days ago. He'd faced a pattern that frightened him and found the courage to seek its explanation. He'd participated in catching criminals and seeing justice done. He'd learned that the world, however mysterious it might seem, could be understood through careful observation and rational inquiry. The phantom coach of Hampstead Heath was no phantom at all, just wood and rubber and human greed. But the lesson it taught was real enough, that appearances deceive, that fear obscures truth, and that understanding, once gained, restores the peace that ignorance destroys. Edward stepped out onto Baker Street into the pale afternoon sunlight. Around him, London moved in its ceaseless flow. Omnibuses and hansoms, clerks and merchants, street sellers and message boys, all going about their business in the great mechanical dance of the city. Above, gulls wheeled in from the Thames, their cries sharp and clean. The air tasted of coal smoke and roasting chestnuts and the peculiar mineral smell of sun-warmed stone. Hampstead awaited his return, quiet now, its phantom laid to rest. Edward would go back to his lodgings, to his surveying work, to his careful measurements and precise calculations. But he would carry with him the knowledge that when precision failed and patterns broke, there were men who could help make sense of the senseless, who could find truth in confusion, who could restore order to the disordered world. The wheels he'd heard in the fog were silent now. The Heath was safe. The documents were secure. And Edward Hartley, junior surveyor, walked home through the autumn afternoon with his unease transformed into understanding, his fear replaced by confidence, and his faith in reason quietly, permanently restored. The mystery was solved. Peace had returned. And in the rooms at 221 B. Baker Street, two men sat by a fire and continued their work, solving the puzzles that London brought them, one careful observation at a time, making the world a slightly safer, slightly more comprehensible place for those who needed their particular genius. The story was done. The pattern was complete. And somewhere, unseen but certain, Watson's pen moved across paper, recording it all for those who would come after, a testament to reason's triumph over fear and to the power of observation properly applied.